Welcome to the panel on research from world building to historical accuracy. Can each of you tell us a bit about yourselves and your projects which have involved world building or research?
Sure. So I'm Ava J., author of Beyond the Red, a young adult sci-fi novel about an uprising on a distant alien planet that threatens the reign of a teen alien queen. I've said that about 1,000,000 times already. But it's in the message of why I need world building, because it takes place on another planet. So aliens and culture and all sorts of things that I had to build pretty much completely from scratch. So yeah.
Yes, Katie, it's you, sorry.
I'm Catherine Locke. I'm the author of Second Position and Finding Center, and my upcoming YA next year is The Girl with the Red Balloon. And it is about a girl who accidentally time travels to 1988 East Berlin and gets caught up in this magical conspiracy, which is related to how her grandfather escaped from the death camps in 1943. So I did a lot of world building for that one. Probably not enough. I'm going through edits in like a couple of months, so probably not enough yet. But yeah, I did a lot of world building for that.
So hi, I'm Laura, and I wrote Pantomime and Shadowplay. So these are the old covers now, and these had a lot of it's secondary world, but I did a lot of research into both the circus and Victorian era Scotland as kind of a jumping off point. And then the just released, as in like really recently, False Hearts, and I remember to grab the US. This is the US cover. Ooh. This is the UK cover, which is very shiny and has red edges. So cool. And this one required a lot of research as well, because it's set in our world in San Francisco roughly 100 years from now. But it has a lot of tech, and I tried to make it tech that would be vaguely possible. And I also had to do a lot of research into cults and neuroscience and how it's affect the brain and conjoined twins and other stuff. So I love to research and world build, so yes.
Hi, I'm Mildred Louie. I'm the creator of the webcomic series Agents of the Realm, which is a college-age magical girl adventure. A lot of the world building I've done with that has been just pulling a lot of influences from different architecture and fashion design just to make the alternative world and history behind the mythology of the story feel real. And then I have two other stories that I'm working on right now. One is called Bound Blades, which is about two mercenaries. And I've done a lot of research on the Caribbean and architecture and fashion there for it, because that's the influence for it. And also my sci-fi graphic novel Catalyst, and I've had to do a lot of research on science and dark matter and space travel and aliens, and it's actually been going really well and a lot of fun.
Hi guys, my name is Wendy Shu. I'm the artist of the webcomic Mooncakes, which is a contemporary kind of straddling the line between young adult and new adult fantasy webcomic about a witch and a werewolf. And for that, I've just been pulling bits and pieces of witch lore that I like from all over the world, but I have had to do a lot of research into Chinese mythology and Chinese witch lore because both of my main characters are Chinese American. And that's been a lot of fun. I'm also working on Asian fantasy right now. It's tentatively a graphic novel, but I'm not going to say a lot about it. But I've had to do a lot of research on. That's more research intensive because I've had to look up like hairstyles and architecture and all that other good stuff. So.
If you know your project is going to need a certain type of world building or research to make something accurate, how do you go about doing it? What's your process?
So the way I start is I basically will first, before I start writing, do whatever I need to start immediately. So like the basic giant world building blocks that I need before I start writing, and as I continue plotting and figuring out the basics of what the world and the culture is going to look like. And then the rest I sort of figure out while I'm first drafting what else I need to research, which is usually the bulk of what I end up having to research. But I don't necessarily know all the details until I've gone through the plot and seen what comes up. And then when I'm revising, I will then focus on those notes, and I'll look through while I'm doing my second read and decide, okay, you know, I'm missing a big chunk of this, so I'll go research that before I continue. And I kind of work back and forth that way through different revision rounds, focusing on a little different aspect each time until I'm done, basically.
Okay. So when I'm writing fantasy, I'm not good at world building. So I'm really good at research. Like, I write a lot of historical fiction and historical fantasy, and I really like doing the historical research. But building magic systems is like really stretching my brain power. So I have been using world building tips that I learned from B.R. Sanders at the Sirens Conference, which has a lot to do with resources, and that's helped me build secondary worlds. Who has resources, who doesn't, who wants them, who doesn't. And that's been a really good skeletal system for me to build secondary worlds. But most of my young adult fiction is historical fantasy, so I'm using real worlds and adding magic. As I said yesterday, I get pretty bored in a book if I don't put magic in it. So a lot of my research is history, and I'm writing... Oh, I can't talk about that yet.
You're writing things.
Secrets. So I could talk about the Sarajevo book. I'm writing a book that's set in Sarajevo during the siege of Sarajevo. So it involves reading a lot of first-person accounts and UN reports and watching movies and watching TV shows and taking notes. And I have a dedicated Moleskine, they call it like the professional note-taker book or whatever. It doesn't matter. It has a log, so I can write down page numbers and that type of thing. And I keep that for every source that I use. For every book, I have a section of that book for that source, so that I can say, okay, I want to go back and put more in about the food. And then I have a whole section where I wrote about food, and here's where I learned about food in this movie, and here's about where I read about food in this book, so that I can put all of those elements in. I tend to obviously over-research. Like, I went down a several-week hole researching feminine hygiene products in East Germany for my book out next year that I didn't use any of at all. That came out in the second draft. So, but
what was the feminine hygiene products like in Germany at that time?
Really rough. If you lived in East Germany, it was really rough. There was a ton of feminine hygiene products, and they were very expensive and hard to find, and like they would come on one day for the next 3 months, and you had to be able to buy all of the ones that you. It was just not a good situation. Yeah. So anyway, so I tend to over-research and then filter out as I go through revisions what I actually want to put into a book and what I don't want to put into a book. I'm a writer who writes and throws out a lot of her first drafts. So I build my books and revisions off of that research.
I'm sort of a blend between Ava and Katie. So I get like the first eureka moment, and usually it's like when I'm washing dishes or when I'm at my desk at my old boring day job, or you know, in the shower or whatever, like doing something kind of vague. I get like, yes, book idea, and it's super exciting. But then I realize, like, I'll maybe write a little bit. Like for False Hearts, I got the idea and I wrote the first viewpoints from each twin, and then I was like, okay, now I have to research everything and figure out what I'm actually doing with it. So I got the voices down, but then I did loads of research. So this was a good one, even though I kind of have iffy thoughts about the author because she said some transphobic stuff. But I did find One of Us, Conjoined Twins, and the Future of Normal by Alice Dummer-Dreger a really good resource for the Conjoined Twins and False Hearts, specifically because it had a lot of interviews from the points of views of conjoined twins and how, you know, they don't actually want to be separated 99% of the time. And so I'll just kind of let things percolate and just research various things, and probably research more than I need to as well. But I'd rather have too much and then not use it at all than kind of not have it and then need it later. But it seems like kind of as I go through the first draft, I'll start falling into little holes as well. And I do like my research. Here's a small selection of my research books.
Wow.
And I also have these really beautiful giant Taschen books, one on circus and one on magic, that are currently propping up my monitor. And yeah, so I do love research, but I can also use it as procrastination really bad. So that's something I have to keep an eye on as well.
For me, I get on Pinterest.
Pinterest is great.
Yeah. I like I guess the two things I really use are Pinterest and Google. That's just like all I use when I'm building stuff. I also have that eureka moment when I have an idea and then I kind of make myself take a step back. And I'm such a visual person that I have to have a good and clear idea of what the world would actually look like. Because once I have a clear idea of what the world would look like, I have an easier time figuring out how the mechanics of the world will be. So with agents, it's a modern day contemporary story, so I'm just kind of doing whatever I want with it, pulling in like inspiration from anywhere that I think would be fascinating and make the world a lot more intriguing just because it is so familiar to everyone. But with my high fantasy story and my sci-fi story, it's like I have these 2 Pinterest boards for both of them. No, actually I have 4. 2 each. One for fashion and then one for like architecture and world building. And I just love spending time like figuring out how people will look and dress and like how their chairs will look and their beds will look and things like that. And it's just a lot of fun. And with Catalyst, my sci-fi story, I'm actually working with an astrophysicist to figure out a new way to handle the intergalactic travel, so that's been a lot of fun. So yeah, don't be afraid to reach out to people who are professionals and know a lot about stuff, especially with something with science. It's intimidating, and people will get very picky about that.
I definitely agree with you, Mildred. If you guys could see the number of Google tabs I have open right now with all of the aesthetic things that I've typed in. For me, I start with something that's kind of fundamental. Like I'm really big into food, so I'm always thinking about like what the food will be like. And I actually like fell down a Wikipedia hole a few weeks ago, just like researching the history of rice and how it's spread throughout like Africa and Asia and how and like different species of rice. It was like really weird. It was really interesting, and I'm always keeping an eye out, just like on Facebook, because a lot of my friends actually like work in archaeology, so they share really interesting articles about history of the world and the history of like crops and stuff, and that all kind of contributes to world building for me. But I'm also I also really like to be a troll because there's like a fountain in the courtyard of a palace that I drew, and I didn't really know like what statue should be there. I was like, should it be like a regal goddess? And then I was like, no, it'll just be a bunch of pigeons because I like pigeons, and that's what it will be. So I agree with Mildred that I like to figure out how things look first, and then the mechanics all kind of fall into place later as I'm sketching it out and thinking about it. But I also like to ask, like, what if, just for fun, and then sometimes that just turns into like a big part of the story. Like I was helping a friend with her world building, and I was just like, what if there were like raptors and people rode on the raptors instead of horses, because I don't like horses.
I support this idea 100%.
I'm sad. I love horses.
No, the raptors. I love horses. I love horses as well. I was just speaking about the raptors.
No, don't.
I mean, yeah, I'm pro raptor.
Pro raptor.
Yeah.
Do you all have very dodgy Google search histories?
Yes.
Because mine's like, how many pints of blood in a human body? What? Like,
does someone die when you slit their throat? And like
yeah. Is it difficult to slit the throat? Like, I wondered if it got like caught on the column, so that was something I Googled. Also, acid. I had to do acid burns, but I didn't want it to be actual acid because I felt like acid burns were very loaded because it's one woman attacking another woman. So I made it liquid nitrogen, so she's still burned, but it's different. And then I had to figure out how she could be partially patched up.
It's always the nicest.
It was pretty gnarly.
looking authors. Right? Like,
I know, I seem so nice.
For Beyond the Red, I had to research a lot about torture methods for a particular scene. So that was easily like the sketchiest thing I had to research. It was
We're all on watch lists.
yeah, definitely on a watch list.
Well,
I like to do all of those things on free Wi-Fi in Washington, D.C. That has happened more than once where I'm like, well, maybe I shouldn't be Googling this in a Starbucks.
FBI come into the Starbucks looking around.
Yeah.
Who's suspicious?
Sorry, Wendy, you were saying.
Oh, no, I was done, but I just don't like horses, and I feel like that's the foundation of all of, like, my high fantasy things is, like, what if there were no horses? How would people get around?
Fair, most
Raptors, clearly.
authors, like, really, really suck at writing horses. Like, they always get major details wrong. So I am also pro high fantasy writers never writing horses again, because horses don't gallop like that, and they don't just randomly talk. Like, the horses are always whinnying. I'm like, the horses don't whinny like that. So I'm pro raptor.
Raptor. Yeah.
We have to start a campaign to replace all horses in fantasy with
Yeah.
raptors.
Or dragons.
Please. I did a concept sketch for one of my Patreon sketchbooks, and it was like, I was like, how do I make this horse but not? So I made it instead into, like, it had a dinosaur head with teeth, but it had like tiny wings on the forelegs, and the back legs and everything else was feathers, and I was like, yes, I like birds.
You artists are like amazing. Like, how did you come up with that?
Oh, I can't do that stuff. I have one story that was supposed to have horses, and then I realized I also hate horses.
It's such a trend.
Yeah. So I replaced them with huge fennec foxes because I thought that would be awesome. Yeah.
Fennec foxes. I approve.
Yeah.
Raptors. It's the conclusion of the panel. Raptors.
So less horses, more raptors and fennec foxes.
I want bumper stickers that only 5 people understand that say less horses, more raptors.
Yeah.
I'll design them for you. Okay. In what way does world building differ from a speculative setting to a contemporary or historical one?
Well, I think that'll depend on what kind of speculative setting, but in the case where you're making everything up in speculative fiction, like in my book, I kind of find that easier in the sense that I don't have to necessarily be accurate to something that already exists, because this world doesn't exist at all and isn't based off of any particular thing. It's just kind of a mishmash of things that I threw together. So in that sense, I found that a little easier than in a contemporary setting or a historical setting where I have to be really mindful of how it affects existing people and how it affects actual history, which other people in this panel can speak of better than I can. So I think that is, in a sense, one of the major differences, depending on what kind of speculative fiction you're writing, that you have a little bit more leeway to just make things up. But on the other hand, it also means you need to be really careful about how you make things up, because you can't contradict yourself, and you need to make sure that the world that you're building, even though it doesn't exist when you build it, feels like a world that could exist and feels complete and nuanced, because otherwise it'll just fall flat and seem like something fake, which it is, but you don't want it to feel that way when you're reading. So
I mostly write historical fantasy, so I can speak much more to writing a historical setting that has magic in it. In that, my biggest concern is I don't want to use magic to undermine or undervalue events in history. So if I'm using magic to help people escape East Germany, I don't want to play loosely with that, because it's real people's lives, and people did live in East Germany and suffer from living in East Germany. And it wasn't easy to live. It was, you didn't have magic balloons that took you over the wall. So I want to be very conscious of that. And I don't want to use magic to make it easier on me as a writer. I think that's a really important part of writing magic into settings that do exist, either contemporary settings that you're putting magic into, or historical settings that you're putting magic into, or even secondary world settings you're putting magic into, is that magic does not exist to make your job easier as a writer.
Sorry, the lights went out. I'm going to turn them back on.
And that goes for technology as well, which I'm sure Laura can talk about, is that technology does not simply exist as a deus ex machina. So that's a big part of what I struggle with and what I am trying to be mindful about. And when I'm making, I use a lot of like blood magic and wild magic, so it has fewer rules because that's just the system of magic that I like working in. So I don't have to worry too much about that, but I do have to worry about what I'm including and what I'm not including in terms of history, because whatever I choose not to include, that is a choice and it's active, and I have to be willing to take responsibility for that because I'm playing with history.
Yeah, for me, everything's kind of inspired by the Victorian era, but I can move pretty like loose with things. So instead of things being steam powered, I have them be a little more advanced, and they are using petrol. So I don't actually say that often. And I did a lot of research on circus and Victorian society. This was a good book. And for the sequel, Hiding the Elephant, this explained a lot of magic tricks, which I basically just stole and put in my magic duel. But for me, the main thing I really had to be worried about, because say, I got something slightly wrong in the circus, or I called the type of carriage like a hansom cab when that wouldn't technically have been invented for 20 years if it was the real Victorian era. I didn't have to worry about that, but what I did want to worry about is make sure that I got the portrayal of my intersex main character right, because there are intersex people in our world now, and I don't want to harm them or fall into stereotypes. So I did a lot of research on that. One of them was the memoirs of Herculine Barban, who was an intersex person in the 19th century, and the story was very sad. But this is written in her own words, and it's really beautiful. Or I'm not sure of pronouns because Herculine went back and forth a few times, but yeah, it's really good, and you should read it. And yeah, with technology, I have that there were basically a really advanced civilization in the pantomime world, and they disappeared, and no one really knows what happened to them, and they might have been aliens, and they left really advanced tech, which to the people in the world is basically magic. And again, it's hard because I could have them do anything, but you don't want them to rely too much on the vestige, as I call it. So I have it that a lot of vestige is breaking down, and it's really messing with their economy, because basically a lot of became a big empire because it had all of the vestige, and now that vestige is breaking. It's a finite resource. It's an oil parallel, and so they kind of have to adapt or die, which means things get intense in book 3, which I'm editing now.
Yay.
I guess for me it depends, because there are a lot of things, actually, a lot of the stories that I make that are heavily influenced by real world things that actually exist. And so many of my characters are also like people of color, they're queer people, so it's incredibly important to me to make sure that I am representing them positively. But with other things, with research, like with my high fantasy story, there is magic in it, and part of it is actually influenced and inspired by Haitian voodoo, which is because I'm Haitian and I am kind of getting cranky over how a lot of voodoo is being represented and used in stories. So I just kind of want to, as someone who comes from that culture, even if my family is somewhat disconnected from it for a number of reasons that have to do with the history of Haiti, I really want to make sure that I do it justice and make sure that it's not just going to be about like voodoo dolls and voodoo daddies and all this crazy stuff that people think are central to it, when in reality it's actually not. And then like with the science in my sci-fi story, it's kind of important to me to make sure that it's believable, and it's hard just because it's in the future, so I can't exactly say that everything is official just because it is speculative, and it's like looking at where science is now and where it's thinking things could go and like imagining where it could actually be during that time period. So I think it's always cool, even when you're doing speculative stuff, that you try and adhere to the real world rules that exist with something, just because I feel like that helps sell it a lot better.
Diana, can you repeat the question? I'm sorry, about speculative fiction versus...
The difference between world building from a speculative setting to a contemporary or historical one.
For speculative fiction, the trends I've seen, because I work with a lot of young adult fantasy in my day job, the trend I've seen is that speculative fiction kind of asks one big what if question for an entire world. Like the example coming to mind right now is a book called Burning Midnight by Will McIntosh. And in that book, everything is the same, except he asks the question, what if these weird, like, colored globes that give people enhanced abilities suddenly started appearing, all over the world one day? How would that change the economy? Like, how would that change the way people relate to each other? Because now you have people with kind of enhanced abilities, and then what happens when these globes become scarcity? Like, what do we do with the rare ones? How much do they cost? Like, he kind of factors all of this into the story. But like that's just kind of tying off of like one big concept, and with stuff that I would classify as like purely fantasy, there's a lot more, I guess, like made up stuff involved about world and about culture, technology. The one trend that like I really don't enjoy seeing is magic being used as a kind of panacea for everything that can be used to like fix a disability, fix when like that sends a very negative message about how disabled people are there to be fixed. So when we were doing Mooncakes, Suzanne proposed the idea, like, what if one of our main characters has a hearing is hard of hearing, and she wrote it in a way so that it can't be fixed with magic, and we have to work around that. She has to come up with a different kind of magic to work with her disability. How does that affect her life, and overall it's been really interesting to be able, and like a privilege for me to be able to draw that story.
This picks up a bit on what Wendy said, but what are some of the mistakes or tropes you're tired of seeing?
So I think the biggest one that we are talking more about, which is definitely a needed and good thing, is when something is represented inaccurately or harmfully that affects an existing group of people. And I think there are probably other people in this panel who can talk about that a little better than I can, but that is something that especially has been a problem in both fantasy and historical fiction and even contemporaries. But we are starting to talk more about it with movements that focus on diversity and accurate and respectful representation. So that's been a plus thing to tackle something that has been really common, unfortunately, and something that I hope continues to go away as we talk about it more and hopefully address it more often.
I am also going to keep this short and sweet because I think that we touched a bit on the magical curing of disability, the representation of people of color, and in fantasy literature is getting better, but we still see fantasy and science fiction written by white men, white straight men, about white straight men at the top of bestseller lists and at the top of award lists and sitting on panels, and that's probably not exactly about this question, but it's related to this question because it's a problem that science fiction and fantasy has been tackling for many, many years. That's probably the biggest one that I see is, and also the excluding of disabled people from genre literature is something like they just disappear in the future. Like there are no people with disabilities, really. There's no one who's neurodiverse. There's no one with a mental illness. There's no one who's queer. There's no one who has gender, gender queer. Like, work with me here a little bit. So I think it's probably the people that the people aspect of world building is what's most frustrating to me and what I most notice now that I didn't notice prior to being involved on Twitter and becoming more aware of this because of Voices on Twitter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not as easy to kind of tune off as it was before, which is good because I was consuming a lot of, like, I feel like the literature I consume now is much more interesting and varied than what I used to read, which is refreshing. I think probably my number one annoyance in world building for secondary worlds is when you kind of take a world that just feels way too familiar, like that pseudo-medieval Landia that has no people of color and it's all white and all straight and really boring, and like no real looking into how trade works and how the economy works. It's just like, and it's either the peasant orphan chosen one hero, and then there's like nobility, and maybe there's like a mercenary, but you don't see that much of the working class. And it's just a story that I've read a lot, and if I pick up a story and it kind of falls into that very familiar mold, it has to do something different for me to keep reading. And also using that pseudo-Midlandia to have the same prejudices we have in our world, like excuses for lots of rape and excuses for erasing a lot of people.
Yeah, it's lazy storytelling.
It's really lazy, yeah. And I'm done. I've read that world a lot.
I'm tired of a few things. One thing I'm really tired of seeing is people trying to make social commentary with the stories that they're writing by be like, there is racism in this world, but it's not like against people of color. It's like about these other races of people, and they're trying to make this profound statement, and it's usually done very poorly, in my opinion. There are some examples when it's done well, but usually it's not. But one great example of one that's terrible is, I think it's called The Pearls or something.
Oh, I think I heard about that.
Oh,
yeah. I read it.
Oh, no! Was it as terrible as it seemed like it was?
Yeah. So basically the premise is that it's like this fantasy story that was supposed to be this commentary on racism, but the way it was set up was that white people were the minority and black people were the oppressors. And if that makes you uncomfortable and you're like, well, imagining all the ways I could go wrong, it probably did go wrong in those exact same ways that you're thinking.
I remember really tone-deaf interviews that she gave as well.
Yeah. Reading that was an interesting experience. So it's usually things like that I'm just like, to stop. And also I'm really tired of like revenge porn when it comes to like traumatic historical events. One thing that comes to mind is like Django Unchained. I am not into that movie, and sure, it seems great like having slaves like have revenge against like their slave owners, but like that's not really gonna fix the current situation. And I'm also over like people trying to retell specific events too as like a way of making people feel better about it.
Revisionism.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's like all those things where they take like these real world traumatic events and time periods and they just try and basically make themselves feel better by rewriting it in a more sympathetic way for them. I'm just kind of like, to stop.
That happens a lot with Holocaust literature.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
American author, it happens a lot.
Yeah.
You convinced me that there were good Nazis. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Nazi romance. I remember that. Horrible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I'm kind of, so I extensively read like YA fantasy and a lot of comics, and what I'm really, really, really over is like people who are well-intentioned, but then they end up portraying this like nameless group of brown people as like the other culture that the main character must go to, or that they like there's like a star-crossed lover story where like one of the characters is from a culture that's obviously like coded like white medievalish, and then the other culture is like nameless brown people. Like I had a huge problem with the Nameless City, which is like well-intentioned. I really do think it was well-intentioned. It's like an Asian fantasy. You know, the Faith Erin Hicks, the author, based it on China, which like fine, but the oppressed class was literally a group of brown people called the Nameless, and they were just there, and they didn't really have any kind of culture that I could discern from the writing, other than, you know, they were darker skinned and had like different clothes, and that really bothered me because there's it's overlooking, you know, a number of things. It's overlooking the fact that historically in China there has been like trade, you know, with Africa, like on the Silk Road. It's overlooking the fact that like, you know, there's racial relations and tensions between Asian Americans and Black Americans today, and that just did not factor into the story at all. But also the fact that like it was a white author trying to write racial dynamics between two different groups of people of color and just not getting it right on any of that level, like that really bothers me. And I've seen this trend. I've seen, you know, and obviously it's been done well sometimes. Kate Elliott is one of my favorite examples. The Court of Five series is amazing. But other times, you know, I think like with Kate Elliott's books, she did extensive research. She asked people from all of the different groups that were represented in the book, and I feel like for a lot of these other books, it just never occurred to the author to do a sensitivity read at all, so it fell short.
Yeah, the internet's not enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, true.
And like I think I said this in another panel too. If people don't do the work, it really shows. Like we can tell if you didn't put the work in, and the work usually suffers.
Right, and the world just feels so hollow, right? Like,
Yeah.
like, why is this fantasy racism here if like why are we just replicating these dynamics that we have in our world without any kind of thought to it? Like, it's not just a thought exercise for so many people, right? Like,
And not deconstructing or subverting. What was that, Katie?
Once you have that, if your world building sucks, your whole story falls apart. Like, why do I care about your character then? Like, tell me why I should even finish this book or care if your character does what they need to do. The world they're operating in is hollow, is fake, as Wendy said.
Okay. So, on the other hand, what do you think is a great example of either amazing world building or good historical accuracy?
So I think when you're so immersed into the world that it's like jarring to realize it's not real is like A+ world building, and I'm sure someone's gonna hate me for bringing this up because Six of Crows is
oh my god.
Yeah, I know I'm stealing this from someone by going first. But yeah, Six of Crows is a fantastic example of incredibly good world building, and not just Six of Crows, but the whole Grisha trilogy and the way that it explores a different part of the world that readers who have read the Grisha trilogy already know, but it still feels like different enough that it's not the exact same country, but it's still the same world, and they're different dynamics. It was really just fantastically done. Plus, the representation in Six of Crows is really, really, really fantastic. So, for those of you watching who haven't read it, you really need to. It is.
I'm waiting for the sequel so I can
I know.
engine both.
Oh yeah, because you'll be really mad at the end of Six.
Yeah, 'cause that's what I heard. So it's the same with book 2 and 3 of V.E. Schwab's book. I know book 2 ends on a cliffhanger, so I'm just gonna wait, even though it pains me.
That was one of my only regret in reading is that I now have to wait for the next book. But it's okay.
It's almost here. It's almost here.
I'm actually going to I was going to mention Six of Crows, but I am going to mention V.E. Schwab's books.
Mm-hmm.
It's so good.
Both the Darker Shade of Magic trilogy and Vicious, and This Savage Song all have really incredible world building. The hallmark of Victoria's writing is that it takes like the first 80 pages of every one of her books to get into what's going on, because she spends so much time on the front end world building, but it pays off because she sets up a lot in the world that affects the plot. So it's really, if you're reading specifically you want to learn how to world build better, I recommend all of Victoria's books. She writes under Victoria Schwab for young adult and V.E. Schwab for her adult books.
Mm-hmm.
And the other book that I mentioned on the last panel is also Planetfall by Emma Newman, which I would definitely recommend. And I don't know how much of this world I can talk about without being a spoiler. So read the book. It's really good, and it's a really interesting world.
So I've got a couple. I've been recommending this book left, right, and center since I read it, and it's The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. I really love it because it's also just like a happy book. Like, you know, there's suspense, but nothing really awful ever happens, so you're not reading with this whole, what's going to happen? I mean, stuff does near the end, but it's like a found family on a ship, and you end up falling in love with everybody. There's loads of, like, it's far enough in the future that pretty much everyone is kind of a medium shade of brown. Like, I think there's one character who's paler, and he's, like, the only one, and it's considered a bit odd. And he's a grumpy guy that you end up liking near the end as well. Everyone has their own story arcs. There's different aliens, a lot of looks at different family structures and different gender and sexuality, and it's really good, and I love it. And I want it to be, like, turned into a TV show so I can curl up and watch it, because I think it'd be great. And then I've been in love with Robin Hobb's books since I was like 15, and she's probably my #1 writing influence, and I feel like she's spent like 20 years now working on the Six Duchies and the world around it, and I don't think I know anyone who's better at world building than her. And I could just gush about her forever and ever. And then lastly, I'll go for Sorcerer to the Crown by Zen Cho.
Oh my god, that's amazing.
Really loved.
Loved it.
I loved it so much because it really had that beautiful, like, high Regency feel, but not like a Mayo blizzard. Like, it had people from different backgrounds, and it had a really great bit with blood magic involving menstrual blood, and I was like, finally. I'm pretty sure Katie will have that too. And yeah, it was just really beautifully written, and I can't wait for book 2. So good. Good job, Sen.
I think the one, it's a webcomic, and it's called Witchy. I absolutely adore the world building and the magic that Ariel, the creator, has set up for it is absolutely wonderful. It's every time I want to feel inspired with world building, I usually pull up that comic, just because I think she just does such an effortlessly good job of setting up the world that I think is inspired by Southeast Asia, and I think she just does a masterful job of it. It's wonderful.
So I have several you guys have hit on, which is my job is to make book recommendations. So the first one I'd like to rec is Sorcerer to the is the Crowns Game by Evelyn Skye. If you like the Grisha trilogy, you will love the Crowns Game. It's set in fantasy Russia, Imperial Russia, and these two sorcerers have to fight to the death, like a magic battle, but it's so romantic and wonderful. And one of the sorcerers is Kazakh, which I've never seen before in fantasy, and I was so pleased to see that. Another set of books that I'm eagerly waiting on the third is the Young Elite series by Marie Lu. It's set this kind of I guess I would say a Renaissance kind of Cretan, Grecian kind of fantasy world, and it's so sad and there's murder, but, but it's really great. the main character deals, and it's kind of like the X-Men, but the main character, it's about like a young girl's descent into villainy, and it's just like she's written in such an interesting and wonderful and dark way. And then the last one that I will mention is Court of Fives by Kate Elliott. She does a really masterful job of making a fantasy world that's exclusively like people of color, but setting it in a not like if I'm reading a fantasy with like someone who's like coded Asian, I'm going to assume it's an Asian fantasy world, but it's not. And I think Kate does a really masterful and wonderful way of putting this world together and of giving nuance to all the different characters and their motivations and their lineage and their history.
Katie?
I have 3 additions that I want to say. N.K. Jemisin's books are also really well built and really well paced, which sometimes worlds that are built really well end up being really slow stories, or vice versa. And that's a really good example of all of her books are really good examples of books that are well paced. Nettie, I think, I'm not sure how to pronounce her. Nettie Okafor, or Lagoon, which is like amazing and like blew my mind. I didn't really know. Like it was so good. It pushed my understanding of what fantasy looked like. And
It's like a point of view of a spider that gets squished or something.
it has that.
Yeah, I thought that was cool. That went into different animals.
Yeah. And then Pretty Deadly, the comic series, also has really interesting world building and pushes the limits of what I thought comics could do. I'm not a huge comic reader. I pretty much read Pretty Deadly and Saga, and those are 2 excellently built novels.
Wendy?
Oh, okay, so this has been on my mind because I just finished it, but The Girl at Midnight by Melissa Gray is just so fun because Melissa has I really like beautiful bird people. That's like one of the entire races of this book is a group of beautiful bird people, and then the other group is a group of like handsome dragon people. It takes place in our world, and especially in New York, but I think Melissa has done this really beautiful job of making kind of a secret world within our world that we don't know about. But if we look, it's there.
That sounds
The
really
second
good.
book comes out soon, so everyone should pick that up.
Yes, please pre-order it. It's called The Shadow Hour.
In terms of historical accuracy, I would like to mention Codename Verity and the consequent books like Rose Under Fire. I don't know. Okay, here. Rose Under Fire and Black Dove, White Raven. I thought they were really good, amazing books, and the historical accuracy in them was amazing.
Yeah, Codename Verity blew my mind the first time that I read it.
Yeah.
Kiss me,
So-
Hardy.
I'm sorry?
Kiss me, Hardy.
No, please don't.
No. Oh no. Okay.
Sorry.
Actually, I have an interview with Elizabeth after the next panel. And unfortunately, it's time to end this panel. So if anyone wants to add anything? Nope. Raptors.
Less horses.
Less horses.
Less horses, more raptors.
Less than full raptors. My brain keeps switching that, because instinctively my brain is like, no, horses.
Horse raptors.
Horse raptors, exactly.
Like centaurs, where it's the
That's
raptor.
terrifying. I think that's like Scorpio races on steroids.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and for the people who are watching at home. And see you on the next panel. Goodbye.
Thank you, Anna. Bye.